Yeah, go ahead.
Hello and welcome to today's seminar on navigating the new geopolitics of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and its place in emerging supply chains of critical minerals. We are delighted that Dr. Jewellord Singh is with us today, Jojo, as we all call him. So welcome to Cambridge, and thank you so much for making your way here today. Dr. Singh is an assistant professor of international development at the International Institute of Social Studies. He's the principal investigator of the ERC Starting Grant Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Metals. His most recent publications include Business of the State, Why State Ownership Matters for Resource Governance, and the politics of designing and negotiating industrial policy, prospects and challenges of state-led development in the 21st century. He's going to be talking to us about Kazakhstan and critical minerals that are available there. So thank you very much. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Monzu. Thank you, Yingfen, for organizing this event. I do feel very scared because I'm in front of the experts on Central Asia, and I will admit that this is the first sort of step in our project. We're actually delving into the Central Asia aspect of our project. And so I might be disappointing a lot of the people here. I think what I plan to do, though, is to sort of set up and place Kazakhstan in the broader research that we're trying to do in this project. So I think one of the main things that I'm already, putting out there as a caveat is that we are just about to start the field research in Kazakhstan this year. So we're hosting a workshop together with Nazarbayev University sometime in May. And that's sort of the starting point of the research. And so I think most of the ideas I will be presenting to you today, these are ideas from the sort of broader picture of the project, what we're trying to achieve and what we hope and what I aspired to, and why I wanted to come here is to actually get inputs from the Central Asian experts to kind of guide us in terms of the thinking in the project. And so that's the basic sort of structure in which I put together this presentation.
Do you want to actually share it on Zoom? It's not being shared on Zoom.
Okay.
While we share the screen, I just wanted to wish everybody a happy Chinese New Year, and I wanted to plug in Happy Nowruz. So the Central Asian New Year celebrations in Cambridge are a big thing, and they're on the 23rd of March this year. So everybody in the room is obviously invited. It'll be in Jesus College. There'll be posters all over the place, but I'll send out information on email as well. Anybody from London, if you want to come, David, you're more than welcome on the 23rd of March. We usually get about 200 to 300 people. There's dancing, there's food, and general merriment. So if you want to come on the 23rd of March, you're more than welcome.
There you go. That will make it somewhat simpler to deal with.
Okay. Thank you. So let me start by giving you a broad overview of what we're trying to do in the project, what are the key questions we're trying to ask, and then sort of place that discussion within the particular context in which we are comparing Kazakhstan with China and Brazil, which are the case studies of this project. Let me start by sort of outlining why we're focusing on what we call critical raw materials. So originally, actually, the project is specifically focused on rare earth elements, but we've sort of opened up the comparison primarily because when I put together this project back in 2019, there was already a lot of discussion, particularly in the EU and the US, about the need to diversify supply chains of critical minerals, but importantly, rare earth elements, because that was sort of the main, one of the key metals for energy transition. Unfortunately, 3 years after, that hasn't happened. We're still 90% dependent on Chinese rare earth elements. And so part of the adjustment I did in the project is to sort of look at the cases that we have and look at what's important in terms of the key minerals in these states that we're looking at, and then looking into what kind of emerging supply chains might be that are being built and forged in order to take advantage of this new export bonanza. I'll start with the basic premise, because I understand that not everyone is sort of, people confuse what critical minerals are, what's a rare metal, what's a rare earth element. So I always start sort of with that aspect. In general now, every national government, Japan, Korea, US, China, Brazil, EU, they have what we call a critical minerals list or a CRM, critical raw materials list. Essentially what this list implies is it's not just a shopping list, it's not a basket of metals. It's about what are the minerals that we need today in order to protect our existing industries, in order to protect our national security, and what are the key metals and minerals that we will need in the future. So in a way, as a colleague has pointed out, this is a policy roadmap. The list is a list of the key minerals that would allow countries to sustain their technological advantage, to catch up in the industrialization race, or to participate in emerging supply chains in the new sectors of the 21st century. But what's particularly important, I think, to remember is what makes them critical. And so on the one hand, they're strategically important, but on the other hand, there's a second characterization amongst these metals, which is that they are at risk of a supply glut, meaning we don't know whether there's enough resources available in order to supply the emerging industries that are connected to these metals. Now, one could argue, of course, that whether the scarcity of minerals is something that we've created or it's something that's actual. So there's a big debate there, both in the scientific community, but also within those who work within the critical minerals sector. Some would argue that this is a question of distribution, and also it's a question of trade rather than a question of actual mineral reserves. But the point here is that this list of metals are important because for our energy transition, for the global decarbonization to actually materialize in the next 10 to 20 years, we need to intensify the extraction of these different metals in order for us to respond to these changing demands. For that reason, in the literature, they're often characterized also as the vitamins of the modern economy. In large part because we don't mine them the way we do copper, iron, nickel, in which, for example, with nickel, because you need nickel for steel, you want as many nickel as possible. And so you would create you would extract the minerals and make the mountains barren. That's not exactly the situation with critical minerals. Some of these metals, we only need them in small scale, but in very small quantities. But the issue really is the technical process of separation and processing. And that's where all the environmental complications, the social implications of extractive industries come in. So it's a very distinctive set of minerals that don't follow the traditional operational processes that we do in base metals, in large-scale mining of copper, as I said, iron, etc. In the project, we focus specifically on rare earth elements, as I said initially. Yingfeng is our postdoctoral fellow. She's focusing on the China work package. We'll still keep the rare earth element focus. We're focusing on how China is building its industrial strategy around upgrading and dominating the rare earth supply chain, but also moving up in the supply chain, participating in the permanent magnet sector and the downstream segments of the supply chain. So we're keeping the rare earth element aspect, but also we're expanding that to incorporate some of the context-specific features of the country cases that we're studying in the project. And this is just to give you a little bit of an idea in terms of the downstream applications of the minerals that we're studying. In the specific case of rare earth elements, they're mostly used for the production of permanent magnets, but also, for screens, for creating alloys, catalysts, but also in the battery storage and battery supply chain. So in our project, the three big questions we want to ask is basically divided into two different phases. On the one hand, we're interested on the question of how mineral producers are going to leverage natural resources for industrialization. So we're very specific in terms of the development, in terms of the dependent variable that we're looking at in the project. We want to know whether countries that are dependent on natural resources can overcome the resource curse. So that's kind of like the big thing in the project. And our approach there is to look at this from the point of view of industrial transformation and economic linkages. So how are countries, what explains, the success of some countries in terms of building economic linkages from the mining industry towards the productive sectors of the national economy? So part of the question is empirical, whether countries are actually doing that. So that's why it's a very fieldwork-based research. We want to know on the ground, whether there are movements in terms of policy, but also patterns of investment in which they're moving away from the mining industry and building more economic linkages and sectors, moving into manufacturing. So that's the first sort of part of the research. The second part of the research, we're interested in terms of understanding how the consumption of these metals are changing the whole supply chain. So unlike most studies in political economy, which often focus on country and region-specific variables that explain, the dynamics of commodity production, we think, or at least my hunch, and we've got some data now on Korea, on Japan, and the EU on this, that the policies coming from the consuming countries are directly shaping the demand, but also the dynamics of the supply chain itself. Meaning that if, for example, the EU promotes a very specific trade strategy, it has a direct effect to the policies that mineral producing countries are going to promote. And so this is important if we want to look at the argument around, the sustainability of the energy transition, because it means we're not just relying on influencing mineral producing countries' policy. We also need to think about how consumption of the metals, how the consumption within Europe, in the advanced industrialized countries, are changing and shaping the dynamics of the supply chain itself. So the way we restructure the project is we're looking at rare earth elements for China, but also there's some rare earth elements we're looking at in the context of Brazil, but also we're now expanding that and looking at base metals and critical raw materials. And what I think is distinctive in the project, I assume this is why we got the funding, is we wanted to look into the intermediate sectors, because what links the production and the consumption are the intermediate production of different alloys, permanent magnets, batteries, before they end up into the high-tech sectors, such as clean energy, electric vehicle cars, military and defense, advanced manufacturing. So I think what's going to spell out the success and failure of our energy transition, and also the technological race, are the dynamics that are involved in who's going to be involved in the intermediate sectors that are so critical, linking the production and the consumption of across the supply chain. Okay, so let me start with an allusion to why we now talk about critical minerals. So what's interesting is I've been involved in some of these policy discussions. When I started this project, I hated the concept of critical minerals. I didn't understand what it actually meant. And then Washington, D.C., the Wilson Center kept talking about it over and over. And in one event, they literally said, okay, so what are these critical raw materials? And they asked me. So apparently the policy world has an idea about, what makes something very critical. And I would start with the European Union, because they actually started this whole sort of list of critical raw materials. Back in 2010, there was a big crisis between China and Japan that led to an embargo. And that led to a whole series of trade dispute between China, Japan, and the EU. And that was a wake-up call for the mineral consuming countries. The EU specifically created this methodology on how to calculate the mineral requirements in order for them to keep the existing industries that they have. And this is the map that shows that. This was published, I think, in 2020. So they keep updating this list. So this list evolved from about 20 at the beginning, back in 2010, and now it's about 50 minerals. So it reflects a lot the critical minerals that are needed for the industry, but also it kind of tells you where the direction of, let's say, trade and investment policy of Europe is going. So the discussion of Central Asia and Kazakhstan wasn't prominent at all in Europe until like 2-3 years ago. And that's because they've identified Central Asia as one of the areas where potentially they can supply critical minerals if they're not going to rely on Africa and Latin America. So this is kind of a map of dependency, but it also tells you the roadmap in which the EU is moving forward, thinking about how it's creating these interdependencies between the EU and the other regions of the world. And one could argue, of course, that this is the same situation for the US and China in particular, because we're looking at these three big powers. Of course, the main demand, what is driving the critical minerals race is energy transition. I mean, I think we kind of know that, but it's actually quite good to look at the data that comes out of it. This is a 2020 report. This is one of the biggest flagship report put out immediately during COVID, actually, by the International Energy Agency. And this is a graph that calculates the revenues that are coming from coal and what we call the energy transition metals. So what you can see here is a steady decline over the next decades of coal and a steady increase in terms of revenues coming from the production of critical minerals. And this is quite an important point because this has also indicated a shift in terms of where venture capital and FDI have been moving. So in fact, this is very consistent if you look at the trends of FDI and venture capital. 4% of the overall clean energy projects, the venture capital in the clean energy projects, they're coming from the critical minerals sector. So this is quite unprecedented. This was the data that came out just last year, 2023. So I think there's an argument to make that we now know that the critical minerals sector is going to be there. It's going to be an important sector because of the decarbonization, but also that, you know, the private sector is following very closely the policy, and therefore there's also movement in terms of where the investments are going. And it's moving definitely away from fossil fuel towards energy transition metals. This is one of the most important graphs that they've shown, and basically it just outlines the enormity of the energy transition requirements. So for example, to build a conventional car, you need less than 50 kilograms per vehicle, but to put together an electric vehicle, you need more than 200 kilograms of different metals. So it's not also just one or two types of metals. That's also the case for power generation, for solar panel, for offshore and onshore wind power. So I think this is kind of like the global picture that gives you an idea in terms of why the critical minerals sector is suddenly such a big industry and why they're paying attention in terms of the amount of investments that are going into it, but also, you know, what type of metals are being leveraged and being promoted as key sectors to look into over the coming years. This is just to show you a little bit of, and I think this is one of the loopholes of these big reports, because basically they're reflecting the existing patterns of consumption and production. So as you can see, when I was putting together the graph, actually I was trying to look for data on Central Asia, and actually there is no major international report that kind of places where Kazakhstan and Central Asian countries are. And I think a large part of that is partly because of, you know, where the existing productions are. So primarily these are concentrated in China, Africa, and Latin America for raw materials. But partly I think it's also because, at least based on our initial conversations with people involved in Kazakhstan, that they were actually quite deliberate in hiding, for example, the production and the reserve numbers. So we know for a fact that there's been this lag in the data, and therefore they actually are not in a lot of the reports that you find now. The strategic competition that we often talk about, that's basically on the rightmost side of the supply chain. That's a question of who produces the ion cells, the batteries, the wind turbines, the assembly of very specific fuel cells. The interesting bit is the second part, which is the process materials, because that's where mineral producing countries are able and can potentially move into the supply chain. So when we talk about, you know, what's the potential for mining countries, what we're really looking at are countries to be able to move from simply the extraction of raw material towards the processing of these materials. And that would basically essentially involve, setting up the factories, promoting specific technologies to make the extraction, the production, the refining, the separation to be more efficient. So that's the kind of policies that we're really thinking about when we're thinking of how to move up in the value chain. I'm gonna skip this, but the basic idea here also is that unlike the oil and gas sector, in the transition mineral sector, we're really looking at very, very specific countries because of the way the geological assets are located. So that's one part of it. But the other part, which is of course quite interesting, is the policy side. Chile and Australia are not the biggest lithium holders. They're not the biggest reserves. The biggest reserves are in Argentina and Bolivia. But because of the policy on lithium in Argentina, in Australia and Chile, they actually are the biggest producers at the moment and the dominant players in the lithium sector. So I think there's also this mismatch between the production and the reserves that countries have. And so a big part of the study that we want to do really is to understand how countries and how policymakers are trying to connect this sort of disconnect between the reserves and actual production capacity in the countries. So for the Kazakhstan work package, what we really want to do is to understand and to analyze the type of opportunities that might exist, but specifically in the promotion of what we call structural transformation. The main idea of the project, as I said, is to understand how countries are moving up in supply chains, whether they have taken advantage of industrial upgrading, and in particular, whether there's a move towards export diversification and economic diversifications. It's a very, very specific measure of economic development that we're interested. That is not to say, of course, that the other factors that are involved, social development, inequality reduction, are not important. But for this particular project, how we compare the three countries that we're looking at, we're really comparing them from the point of view of industrialization rather than broad notions and logics of economic development. And secondly, what we're most interested is the degree of success in terms of leveraging multiple policy instruments in order to pursue structural transformation in mineral economies. One of the main, the sort of giant literature in development studies and in political economy is the resource curves. And all of us know that this is a whole literature that came from the Middle East, Africa, but now also they've been applying this to the Central Asian countries. So I know there's a couple of books that came out on Central Asia looking at rentier politics and state building. One of the main questions we really have is how countries are trying to leverage different policies and also identifying what are the most important policy packages that need to be sort of put together. So there's also a bit more normative aspect in the research that we're doing. We want to think about how mineral producing countries were able to do it in the past, but also how are they changing their policy in the present in response to these complex changes that are taking place, the geopolitical changes, the strategic competition, but also the movement in the supply chain, because the supply chain isn't static in terms of technological diffusion, in terms of which companies are emerging, etc. We start our research in this project by looking into how industrialization took place in most of in East Asia mostly, because we think that this is where the idea of industrial transformation really, is more applicable. And one of the most important aspects of industrialization is the promotion of a development strategy that aims to move up in the supply chain through capital-intensive and high-tech manufacturing. So if we take, for example, the case of Korea, Korea's success as an economic powerhouse was through the focused industrial policy on semiconductors and steel production. So it's really choosing very specific sectors that they think would drive the national economy for industrialization. But the second part that, I think the research now that we've done in East Asia has shown is that, yes, the industrial policy is important, but there's a second aspect to that, which is that a lot of Asian countries, the Asian economies, were able to secure access to raw materials. So they actually never had to think about where the iron would come from. So through a trade policy, you would be able to promote trade, and then using trade, your trade policy, you can then have an industrial strategy. I think part of the difficulty, particularly in the countries that we're looking at now, and there's some evidence, for example, in the case of Brazil, in our project, is that this assumption that you can secure these metals isn't necessarily true for many countries, but also because there's now a competition for protectionism taking place at the global level. It's becoming more and more difficult to convince technological transfer as a policy to be implemented. And so the idea before that you could develop through supply chains and through technological diffusion, this may not be the case in the context of 21st century industrialization. And so I think the new industrial, sort of the new international division of labor that's emerging after the first 25 years, because next year it's 2025 already, in the first two and a half decades, I think we're really facing a much more difficult situation for an industrial catch-up for these mineral-producing countries. The second aspect is that because of the success of the US as a unipolar hegemon in the 20th century, a lot of the development strategies were premised on integrating themselves into a world order, into an international political economy in which the US was the major driver. I think this assumption is also changing now, A, because of the rise of China and other emerging markets, but also B, because of the idea itself of global market integration as sort of a premise for industrialization. If we look into the current race for technological competition, we're now seeing efforts to create, for example, the debate on de-risking and friendshoring. A lot of these debates, they are premised on the assumption that we cannot rely on an integrated global economy anymore. And therefore, access to specific minerals, access to specific primary commodities is not something you can take for granted anymore. And that's changing the trade policy of countries. That's changing their industrial strategies at the same time. So until we come to a conclusion in terms of what the world order might look like, it becomes very complicated for mineral producing countries to figure out, what's the appropriate industrial strategy. And so the lessons coming from the 20th century development, how Korea succeeded, how Taiwan succeeded in terms of driving capital intensive manufacturing, that may not be as applicable today as it would have been in the past, in 2-3 decades ago. In the context of Central Asia, I think there's 3 important elements in the geopolitics that we want to pay attention in this project. The first is sort of at the domestic political level, what are the statehood legacies of the Soviet Union and what are the important institution building processes that are driving industrialization? So to a large extent, of course, this is one of the most understudied area, partly because I think, for example, if we look at Central Asia, Soviet Union, post-Soviet society studies, they're actually just concentrated either in the US and in the UK. So there's a big sort of gap, particularly in at least in the world where I operate in development studies, in terms of a good understanding in terms of how statehood and state building is unique and different in the context of Kazakhstan and Central Asia. So that's at the domestic level that we're trying to look into the project. The second is, of course, while there are institutional legacies that are left by the Soviet Union, there's also growing economic presence and connectivity that is being forged through China's Belt and Road Initiative. And you know this much more than me. But I think based on our initial research already, we know for a fact that China's presence in Central Asia is going to continue. There's enough data showing that there are investments going into different sectors, food processing, for example. There were attempts on manufacturing specific types of automotives, etc. What we haven't seen yet and what we hope to achieve in the project is to look into specifically investments that go into the critical mineral sector and the related industries that are there. So in principle, we would be very interested to look into the renewable energy projects that are there and the extent to which there's coordination in these policies. And finally, the significance of traditional powers such as US and Japan, and I would argue even Korea, because we now have, I've done a couple of interviews and fieldwork in Korea. They've been very interested in Central Asia. There's been a lot of attempts, but mostly unsuccessful in terms of building trade relations with Central Asia. And so these three different sort of geopolitical and institutional factors might influence the way we understand the process of industrialization and structural transformation in Central Asia. Of course, what is known, what is established in the literature, at least in political science and political economy, is the success of some Central Asian countries in terms of promoting a multi-vector foreign policy in order to promote a much more balanced attempt to rebalance its relationship with different major powers. So I think for us, the most important question really is how is to evaluate the success of this approach in terms of promoting structural transformation. So not just in terms of the changing geopolitical dynamics and handling sort of the complex politics at the international level, because that's a much more IR sort of project. So for us, what's important is what this means in terms of economic transformation and industrial transformation opportunities. One of the most difficult thing that we've encountered is sort of looking for credible data, and that's why I think the field work would be really important, is to just get as much on the ground material as possible. But as far as we know, at least in the case of Kazakhstan, we know that a lot of its metals are something that the European Union, there's a match between the list of the CRM that the EU wants and the kind of metals that we can find there. The importance, of course, of mining is established in the literature. It was mostly oil and gas in the past, but now we're seeing the rise of the mining industry as an important sector, as an important contributor in the industrial output, at least for Kazakhstan, but I think that also is true for some of the other countries. The complication, of course, with Kazakhstan is because it's an upper middle income country that is also at the same time a very resource-based economy. It's very difficult to find a comparable case for that. But that's why I think so. In our project, Brazil is an interesting comparison for Kazakhstan, because Brazil is a resource-intensive economy. A lot of people, of course, think that Brazil it achieved its industrialization in the 60s and 70s. But in fact, a lot of its export diversification and economic diversification were pretty much similar to what you find in Kazakhstan. So it's very much resource intensive. It's very much based on specific commodities and building supply chains, dominating the supply chain. So I think there's an interesting story we hope to be able to capture, comparing Brazil, Kazakhstan, and China at the national level at least. And then, of course, looking at the connections of these three countries. In terms of the significant instruments that we think might be important to consider, the first is that the time-tested debate on the public versus private. This is an important question because historically, industrial transformation requires the mobilization of centralized political authority. That's the case of the Chinese industrialization strategy. But I think what's interesting, particularly in the resource sector, is the way in which the resource assets are managed. There is, of course, a literature that has argued against state ownership in the context of Central Asia. We know the work of Erika Weinhall, and the idea around the need for a robust private sector in the mining industry. So I know Erika really well because she's in the board of our project. So we've had that discussion with her. I think part of what we're interested really is the degree to which private sector capacity building is going to deliver structural transformation, because in many cases of resource-based development, they've actually been done by national companies. And so I think what we want to kind of look into the project is this relationship between state control and state ownership and the development of a competitive private sector. So what we're hoping to do is to be able to kind of establish this empirically. The second major instrument beyond state ownership is the idea of linkages. Now, the idea of economic linkage came from classical political economy, such as Albert Hirschman and Friedrich List. But specifically, the idea of leveraging resource rents for development is something that's new, because as we know, with the resource curse, we often assume that resource rents are wasted all the time by national elites. They're often used for consumption as opposed to production. But there are interesting experiments in the past 20 years looking into the development of related industries using the mineral sector. So it could either be, for example, the development of battery storage systems. So that's one successful case in the context of China. The other one would be the creation of using local content policy in order to build linkages between the oil industry and petrochemical sector. So there are very, very specific examples. It's not universal because, again, the difficulty when you're dealing with the question of the resource curse is that they're actually not very, there's not a lot of good examples of resource-based development. So we need to kind of look into very specific examples of economic linkages. And finally, particularly in the context of Kazakhstan, we would like to really look into the strategic deployment of foreign direct investment policy and how it's being used to steer the direction of investment. So a large part of that is state capacity question, but also I think that there's a political will question that we would like to look into. Basically, what drives the direction of investment, where it's going, and what kind of strategic sectors are being looked at in order for the country to build economic linkages between the mining industry and the productive sector. And this is just to give you an idea in terms of, like, for example, if you take the battery technology value chain, a lot of these metals actually, they are existing, they're very much present in Central Asia, in particular in Kazakhstan. So part of the reason why and I'm going to talk a little bit now about the EU strategy, but the reason why battery technology value chain is very important is because a lot of the critical materials that are needed to build these battery supply chain within Europe, they will need to come from Central Asia and Africa. And so a large part of the development strategy for mineral producers has to do with leveraging this demand and using this demand as a bargaining chip for trade policy and for investments, to drive the investment, to drive, the direction where the factories need to be built, what kind of production facilities, what kind of energy efficiency measures need to be implemented. Of course, the main problem with, for example, with the battery supply chain is the high-tech, more advanced aspects of production. They're still controlled very much by the major powers. So, for example, the big battery productions, they're basically Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. The EV supply chain, they're basically American and Chinese and Volkswagen, so it's German. And then, of course, the cell components, this is a competition between the Japanese and the Chinese. So I think what's interesting is that although in policy discourse, a lot of countries are talking about the need to help mineral producing countries move up in the supply chain, actually the supply chain itself, there are so many bottlenecks in terms of the technological movement that you would need an industrial strategy, a coherent industrial strategy, and an FDI strategy that would allow you to move from the different stages or to move across the stages of the supply chain. And so most of the mineral producing countries are left on the leftmost part, the production of lithium and nickel. You may be able to develop specific extraction technologies to make it efficient, but that doesn't give you the higher value added activities that you need in order to move into cell components and battery cell production. So a lot of the differences among mineral producing countries, they're really based on the ambition of the country. How far do you want to build the supply chain? So for example, in the case of Indonesia, they want to go all the way to the battery cell production. They want to actually try and get EV cars to come in and then have battery production facilities in Indonesia. And so it's really dependent on the degree to which governments are willing to put in the risk, because these are very long-term, capital intensive and long-term investment plans. And it would require much more in-depth and penetrative industrial strategy for it to work. I'm gonna skip that. Okay, so I think where I want to end up in the discussion is what these opportunities look like as the supply chain changes very quickly. In the course of our project, so we started in 2020, this has changed dramatically over the past 3 years. So for example, we started when the Americans were simply just not interested in building supply chains. So that was 2018, 2019. They were just interested in creating, a protectionist trade policy under Trump. And then you move from that point to the Biden policy, where you have a very extensive subsidy system now through the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think these geopolitical changes are really important to understand where the opportunities for industrialization are opening and closing for mineral producing countries. In terms of from the point of view of the mining countries themselves, it has been recognized increasingly that mining the resources themselves has a huge potential in terms of national security, weaponization. So that's the case of China and Russia. So there's an argument that China and Russia are weaponizing their natural resources. But I think for most countries, they see this more as an opportunity for reindustrialization, using the mineral wealth as a way to increase investment, as a way to mobilize foreign investment so that you can drive new production facilities, so that you can create emerging industries and you can participate more in the supply chain. In this particular approach, the most important policy instrument is a clear policy on processing and refining of the metals. And not a lot of mineral producing countries have actually done this. A large part of it is because of the pressure externally. So for example, in the case of cobalt and lithium, because they're so important for the EV car industry, it would just not be possible for the lithium and cobalt producing countries to direct the policy. There's so much pressure coming from the EU and the US that the policy needs to be more open, that they will have access to the critical minerals, and therefore there's less space for these countries to use and leverage the mineral in order for them to promote economic diversification. The big example is the nationalization of lithium, which is happening in Latin America and consequently in Africa. There's a big resistance on the nationalization of lithium, primarily because you will cut the access of private companies in these minerals. And then of course they fear that if you cut access, then our global decarbonization efforts will be stalled. So a lot of it is geopolitics, a lot of it is technological competition, but a large part, I think, is this fear around how critical minerals are being used and weaponized by countries, by mineral producing countries. So there's kind of two interpretations of the nationalization policy. Because of course, from a mineral producing point of view, if you want to move up in the supply chain, you need to nationalize the resource. You need to have more control over where the production facilities are built, what kind of contracts could be created in order to make it more pro-development, pro-industrial policy, pro-industrial transformation for the country. We now have quite an extensive set of examples of how this actually happened and how the West has resisted. The outright ban on exporting nickel in Indonesia was heavily resisted by the US and the EU, and China took advantage of that. When Indonesia said we want to ban the export of raw nickel, so historically you would just get the ore and then sell it abroad. So now they banned that and they require processing facilities in Indonesia. The first thing that happened was the Chinese built production facilities in Indonesia for fear of losing access. Then the Korean and the Japanese followed. The problem, of course, is the US and EU did not follow, and so now they're on a WTO dispute against Indonesia. So same policy instrument, for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons, it's becoming very difficult for mineral producing countries to actually promote them. Another kind of policy instrument, as I said, was setting up new state enterprises in order to have more control over the contracts and ownership. That's also creating a lot of problems, particularly in lithium. But I think in many countries where they plan to have critical minerals as a key export, this would be a turning point of dispute for many countries. In In the case of Kazakhstan, I think what's really important to consider and what we want to do in the project is to look at the extent to which BRI projects could be leveraged as part of a wider strategy to mobilize investments. Because we know that there are investments coming in, we know that there's data showing renewable energy is a strategic sector that even the Kazakh government has identified. But of course, a large question there is the degree to which there's going to be a geopolitical alignment. There's going to be an alignment between the geopolitical interest and the actual industrial policy in order to promote these investments. On the side of the mineral consuming countries, the most important aspect, particularly in the research that we are doing, is the degree to which de-risking is taking place. So we've now moved away. So we now know that we will not decouple. I don't know whether you know this whole debate about decoupling and de-risking. Initially, they thought, because China became the center of the manufacturing industry, the Americans and the Europeans thought, okay, we need to, as much as possible, disconnect our economy from China. So that was the decoupling strategy. Immediately after 1 year, they realized it's impossible. Because, you know, if one country is producing everything in the world, how can you decouple from that? And so now they came up with this new concept, which is de-risking, which is essentially the idea is you need to protect specific industries. So, you know, you would allow certain interdependence, but at the same time, in key sectors where you consider them to be of national security or they are part of what we call high economic security priorities, you would put in place specific measures. So for example, FDI screening policy. The EU investigation on subsidies on EVs is part of this de-risking strategy as well. So the way to understand these different policies and to connect them is really to look into the degree to which this de-risking strategy is supporting the overall geopolitical and geostrategic interests of the major powers of these mineral consuming countries. Now, there's a whole question around how you deal with the fact that major countries that have clear conflict of interest with the EU and the US, such as Russia and China, also hold the most important critical minerals that we need for energy transition and for the technological race. So the fact that we will not have an alternative rare earth supply chain makes it very difficult for de-risking to work in practice. And so there's a whole question around what are you going to do with the fact that China remains to produce 90% of rare earth elements. And so I think part of, at least part of the findings we have now looking into the consumption side is that countries are much more amenable for cooperation on very, very specific sectors. In the case of rare earth elements, for example, they've accepted that we will need to keep depending on China for rare earth elements. For lithium production, for example, we will remain to be dependent on lithium refining facilities coming from China. So the geopolitics of the supply chain is changing, but it's not changing in the way we thought it would. It's not going into the direction of decoupling, we're de-risking. We're kind of creating protectionist measures in order to secure specific interests, but it's not going in a direction in which we're going to create two supply chains, that sort of the China-based supply chain and the US-based supply chain. So I think that's one of the main things that we need to consider. And that becomes a great opportunity for mineral producing countries because, you know, the mineral producing countries will then have access to the two markets, which is quite difficult 2-3 years ago because of the discourse on decoupling in EU and the US. The final area I want to talk about is specifically important for Kazakhstan and Central Asia, which is the role of the EU in all of this. The most important strategy that the EU has promoted in order to secure its access to mineral is through trade agreements. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but so I want to outline the three main things that they're doing in the critical mineral sector. They want to promote trade agreements in countries that they didn't have strong trade relations before, so that's particularly new. That means extending trade agreements to countries that they, for example, Kazakhstan, Chile, Indonesia, very, very specific countries, South Africa, because, you know, these are countries that hold very particular minerals that they need for the decarbonization. The second is doubling down on investments in recycling and rebuilding the circular economy. The emphasis here is actually to create a more robust and sustainable secondary supply chain, so to speak. So the idea is eventually you will be able to reuse all the materials that we have, that we are using now, so that in the next sort of phase, next generation of raw material extraction, we would need less. The extent to which that's successful is debatable, of course. And then finally, limited diversification through regional supply chain. For some reason, the EU still thinks that it would be able to convince European countries to open the mining industry here. I know for a fact that they can't, because I've been doing interviews with the mining industry here. They're very frustrated. But also, I think the environmental question is very difficult to get around. Imagine Sweden opening new mining projects on rare earth, for example. So there's been a big mining project in Sweden that they could not get an environmental permit for about 5-6 years now. It's the same mining project that has been evaluated over and over again. And a large part of that is, of course, the environmental footprint. One could argue that the EU is essentially externalizing all its environmental footprint in order for it to keep itself green. But I think what's really important is to imagine that the EU, what it's trying to do is to have multiple types of strategies and then kind of pushing them forward and seeing which one floats and which one effectively works. At the moment, I think it's the trade strategy which is the most effective.
You can, yeah, the first
This
one,
one, no? Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. I'm gonna just focus on the first strategy because I think that's the most important. It's basically to rebuild the primary supply chain. Historically, it's well, at least in the past 5 years, the idea they have is to build new mining projects within Europe. That's not exactly the case anymore, and that's why they've developed the idea of an extensive trade strategy. The principle behind this essentially is that although we are working on the assumption that economic security is the guiding principle now of trade, so we've now moved away from the logic of globalization, the logic of free market. So the EU is very clear on this, that high politics and energy and economic security are the new principles that drive economic policy in the European Union. The most important assumption remains to be that through a trade policy, the world market, the logic of the logic of the supply chain would resolve the access question. And so what the EU has been doing is essentially to promote very extensively a trade strategy in which they try to entice third countries to incorporate and align their trade and investment and industrial strategies to the EU interests. So a good example, of course, is the EU high-level meetings, policy meetings, in which the EU would send, to these countries. So they went to Chile, they went to Kazakhstan, they went twice to the Philippines. So there are very, very specific metals that they know are extremely important. Sorry. There are important elements there, the important metals that they need, and these metals would need to be secured at all costs, and therefore they would be much more willing to extend more generous trade agreements with these countries. I'm gonna skip the recycling bit because I don't think that's important, but it's just to note that it's not a one or the other type of strategy. They're doing this all at the same time, putting in resources and investments. I think the most important aspect, which is the third aspect, is what they call raw material substitution, which is basically to replace one type of metal with the other, with the assumption that we won't have access problems in the process of replacing them. Now, there are many critiques to that. Part of it is you may be replacing one type of dependency to another. So a good example is they switch from palladium to platinum. So you basically switch from Russia to South Africa in terms of dependency. You switch in the production of permanent magnets, because initially the permanent magnets were based on copper. They didn't want to be dependent on copper, on Chile, on Zambia. So then they switched to rare earth. Then they became dependent on China. So part of the difficulty with raw material substitution is, of course, apart from the technical aspect and the technological dimension of that, is that unless you actually have these mineral reserves in your own borders, you're going to be dependent one way or another from country A to country B. The second aspect is that they actually rely very much on leveraging private investment. So if you remember, for example, the Global Gateway EU, so this is EU's answer to the BRI, that is pretty much about leveraging private investment, using private investment vehicles to move investment into Africa. And of course, there's a big debate on how effective that is. We know, for example, that state-led investments by the Chinese are much more effective in terms of long-term access to minerals. So that's been proven and that's been shown in the literature. The degree to which that's working for EU, we still don't know. The US model is pretty much similar to the EU in that case, because in the case of the US, they're leveraging private investment. But of course, the difference is there's more instruments that the US government can use. For example, in the IRA, they can use tax credits, subsidies, etc. The unintended effect is you may be creating new technologies, but then you're creating future supply gluts in the future because, well, you basically don't know what kind of dependency you're creating as you move from one technology to another. Finally, I want to just sort of wrap up by talking about what we plan to do in Kazakhstan, because as I said, this is very much early stages of our work in Kazakhstan and China. So the first thing we want to do is to track down FDI movements and sectoral policies. In particular, we want to kind of look into the data at the national and subnational level. We're planning to do fieldwork in 3 places, in Astana, Shikmen, and Almaty. The objective is to create a measurement of capacity of how regional and national governments can link or are able to link FDI with other components of industrial policy. We also want to track down different sector-specific policies, in particular those connected to clean energy projects, and the extent to which these economic linkages with mining are being formulated, how successful they are, and which clean energy projects they're choosing. Because as we know, not all clean energy projects are created the same way. And so that's a political choice, and that we also want to look into the process of how they come up with that. In terms of very specific methods, we plan to conduct semi-structured interviews with businesses and government officials. And we plan to use the current workshop that we will be organizing in Nazarbayev in May as a starting point for this. The other aspect is to do what we call industrial ethnography, which is basically trying to track down private investors in the business conferences. So apparently that's what they call them now, industrial ethnography. I learned that recently. But the basic idea is, because we're working in countries that traditionally qualitative research methods don't work, we need to be a bit more creative in terms of collecting data. And then, of course, the traditional, more archival type of research. Just to wrap up everything, we think that, for example, generally in the research that we've been doing, we now see this link between critical minerals, energy security, they call it in Korea, they call it high economic security, the principle of high economic security. And so the increasing prominence of national security narratives in economic policy making, that's something that we've tracked down in the empirical work that we've been doing. We hope to be able to do this more extensively in the 3 countries we're working on. We know that the critical minerals are not created similarly. They have varying effects on mineral producing countries. A large part of that has to do with the geographical dimension, but also I think the policy side is quite important. How you leverage minerals and how you promote concerted policy efforts that link very specific industries. The more specific, the more technically sound they are, the more likely you'll be able to create a more extensive industrial strategy. And the fact of the matter is, whether you want, and I think we've seen this, it's almost not a choice for mineral producing countries to mine anymore. I'm very afraid to say that. There's a whole question, of course, in the mining. I've been working on mining for 10, 12 years now. Before, we were asking, oh, do communities have a right to say no to mining projects? So yeah, that was like a big question. The whole debate on FPIC, the debate on ILO 169, all these international standards are all about giving voices to communities. But I think the whole clean energy transition has hijacked that debate. And we're now in a position in which national security doctrines and development imperatives are driving the discourse on development, but also I think it's driving, most importantly, it's driving the investment. The private investments are coming in. The mining sector is expanding. The mining sector is now the most important sector in clean energy. And so that's making it harder and harder for mineral producing countries to say no. And so a large part of our research objective is to understand the how question, because the why is not so relevant anymore. How are these countries adjusting to these emerging supply chains? Which countries are emerging as winners and which countries are falling behind? We know for a fact that cobalt is a very big thing, DRC is lagging behind, not because they don't have control over the mineral, because most of the EV car companies are moving away from cobalt batteries. And so it's an external pressure that's creating a different dynamic in the supply chain. And so for mineral producers, they need to be really careful and they need to think about what the future supply chain might look like, and therefore have an industrial strategy that aligns their industrial policy to these dynamic changes. And I think finally, just to conclude, in most of the research on mining, we often don't look at the consumption side because we think what drives the mining industry? It's prices, speculative investments, it's the terms of trade. So these are typically three different important economic variables. But actually, a lot of the industrialization efforts, a lot of the strategies on access to minerals in the advanced industrialized countries are directly impacting the movement of capital, but also the policy direction in the mineral producing countryside. You cannot nationalize if you know that in the future there won't be any demand for the metal. So the cobalt nationalization is not going to happen for that reason. They have this idea that in lithium it might stay for a bit more, but we don't know how long because they're also developing other technologies. So mineral producers need to keep paying attention to the evolution of these industrial strategies of mineral producing countries. And I think I will end there to give time for everyone to ask questions.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very good talk. Thank you so much for talking us through what critical minerals are, because actually that was one of the questions asked yourself. Who asked that, but I didn't laugh. So I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. Both in the room and on Zoom. If you're going to ask a question on Zoom, please use the raise hand button or leave a question in the chat. We'll switch from the room to Zoom. So I'll give the classroom a chance first.
I'm gonna say something if you. Other questions are still coming. So first of all, thank you. It was excellent sort of overview and interconnections. So I just wanted to a couple of comments, and we have plenty to discuss, I think, this afternoon. I just wanted to tell you, one of the main questions that we keep asking, which you raised very rightly, is the critical for whom, and whom is a very important thing which shifts all the time. And it's true for similar industries around, but this one is particularly interesting to how people see who is it critical for and is it relevant to them. But I just actually can more or less explain why you start to see Central Asia in EU story recently. So if you come look at some conference programs or projects that we've been running since 2006, we've been saying this, and we didn't get much traction here. So in Europe, particularly in this northern part of Europe, there were actual scientific projects being offered to find replacement for rare earths. This is going back already in late nineties, and so there was at some level understanding that we could become dependent on these in geographies and geologies which are not, let's say, particularly friendly to us. And on the other side, Central Asia was of course not in everybody's mind, as you rightly said. So we were actually talking to Central Asia audiences and trying to tell them that they need to present themselves as possible actors in the story. And they did. That started to filter through. There are some people here in the audience, Turkman and others, we've been talking about this for a number of years. So that started to now finally seep up. And if you can actually do a literature cycle, you'll find out, you'll see our presentations from 2006 onwards, just saying some of these things. But that's just for further discussion. What as a conceptual thing, or one thing that I've been thinking about, and you raised it, is how there are few cases for resource-based development. And I think that is an important but not difficult question. Important in the sense that the most, up till more or less now, we have the colonial era in every form. So resource development was happening by removal of resources where they were. So any resource-based stories will only start to emerge. There'll be few, and they will start to now come through the process that you're talking about. So that's something you need to perhaps consider. That it's not surprising that there are very few cases. Maybe you didn't mean that, but I just wanted to articulate that. Yeah. So with that, I'll stop. Yeah.
I'll let you respond if you would like.
We can.
Do you want to respond, or?
I think we could collect maybe one
Yeah,
or two more, yeah.
Kirill first, and then I see that there was some things on Zoom.
Sure, yeah, but
The chat.
Thank you for presentation. I had also a number of thoughts, but I think so. Couple of things that were most curious, I guess. One about the research. So in your data collection plan, I was trying to see whether what was the narrative collection focus, in a sense of are those projects, are those locations, are those specific sectors, are the specific minerals? And because I wasn't sure early on, you kind of mapped out for us, kind of global geography. And then I was thinking whether there's anything specific, and I think it's also, fits interestingly into question of critical for who, because maybe certain locations would be, there will be FDI from one part of the world coming, or, some actors for whom those minerals are more critical than the others, and maybe it won't be, that kind of, not even the necessarily the conflict of different spheres of investment, but kind of the map of how they will interact with each other will be dependent on the demand that they have internally.
Like this.
And the other question is, I listening to your presentation and understand that you have a lot of your experience comes from policymaking discussions. I was wondering, how in this story do you see the agency of large business, especially coming from US but also EU, which obviously with these types of projects, in terms of mining and processing, it always goes through policy making, but they're often way more pragmatic, right? So for instance, when you are speaking about Indonesia, but I imagine in countries like of Central Asia, it's also applicable. Why wouldn't they just say to policymaker, and what plays out for me is interesting, like politically, hey, we just want access, so can you make it happen? Like if what China is doing just by making the investment happen there is giving them access to materials, we just want it solved. So why is there with Indonesia, for instance, this strong arming then through arbitration? And I'll stop there. Maybe if there's time, I'll ask more questions.
Yeah, so I think both questions on who is it critical for is an interesting question, I think, primarily because when you get into conversation, for example, from an EU policymaker's point of view, what they're really looking into and what they're really thinking is, how are we going to get access to these minerals so that we can sustain the existing industries, and how, basically how we can sustain the existing industries and how we can formulate the new industrial strategy that because there is a new industrial strategy now at the EU level. Brazil has an industrial strategy. So a lot of countries actually have a clear idea in terms of what their energy transition pathway might look like, but also what sectors they are looking into as significant in terms of emerging supply chains. So for example, in the case of Korea and Japan, they're not necessarily thinking of clean energy as in EV cars, because the automotive industry in Japan and in Korea, they're not interested in participating in the EV car, because that's basically BYD and Tesla and Volkswagen. They're more interested in mixed or hybrid vehicles, for example. So it's a very different set of metals then that they will need to secure in order to be able to participate in that supply chain. A large part of the question of criticality, I think, is it hinges on a good understanding of the industrial organization and the structure of the economy of the countries that you're looking at. So I think for mineral consuming countries, that really differs. In the case of Korea and Japan and China, semiconductor is the big thing at the moment. They want to, as much as possible, move up in that supply chain. China is trying to catch up in terms of the production of very specific semiconductors in order for chip making, because chip making essentially is so critical in all the other downstream segments. For mineral producing countries, I think it's a lot less complicated in a way, because if you have the metals, the question is, do you want to become an export producer of chromium or tungsten or rare earth elements? An interesting comparison is Brazil has a lot of critical minerals, but they don't want to mine them in the same way that Chile and Argentina do, because they're more interested on the higher value added activities in the downstream segments. They're more interested on investments on electric vehicle cars rather than batteries, for example, because they don't have the domestic companies that could take advantage of the battery supply chain. But they have automotive companies that have historically led the industrialization in Brazil. So I think the question of criticality and what is it critical for, I think you really need to look into sort of the very specific country features and the political economy dynamics in these countries. What we're still trying to figure out is the direction in which Central Asian countries, in particular Kazakhstan, is what we're really interested in. We had a couple of meetings with the embassy of Kazakhstan in the Netherlands. So part of what I do in the project is to almost do the policy legwork for the other team members. And what's interesting is they're not so clear themselves in terms of where they think the priority sectors would be. And that's kind of difficult, I guess, in a context in which if there's so much external pressure to decide very quickly, what kind of industrial plans, what kind of investment plans do you want or do you need? So I think that's also part of the research that we're trying to do. The question on, I agree with the point on why is there no resource-based development a lot of examples. Part of it is because, the biggest resource producer is Africa. So you have Africa and Latin America. So that's historically where they come from. African experience of colonialism, that only ended in the early 70s. So, that's pretty much exactly your point. Latin America is interesting in that sense because they had 100 years prior to everyone else. And then, so actually, I think that's the real story of the resource crisis and resource dependency. How these countries became entirely dependent on single commodities like sugar and sugar, coffee, and then they moved to silver and then tin. And so I think a large part of the Latin America story is how they manage the resource, but also this dynamics between the public and the private. What is missing, so we're doing a handbook on resource nationalism. We've been actually struggling on Central Asia too, because I think we couldn't find that story and part of it is, ignorance on our part as editors, but a large part as well is finding also the people who would look at it from that particular point of view. So we're interested, of course, in looking and telling that story on resources beyond the rent-seeking story, because I think that's what we are a bit unhappy with. You cannot tell the story of countries that successfully became middle-income countries through the resource sector. And I think that's an interesting story by itself. That's actually a progressive story in development studies, but that's not being told.
If you want that, MPhil essays for the last 10 years. Literally, I am not kidding.
Thank you.
For
I
last
will-
10 years, MPhil essays, we have so many fantastic, some of them are here actually, who wrote about this stuff, and some of them hopefully will write something very soon.
Well, and we thank
This
for one of them.
is
Uh-huh.
what we do, this is exactly,
Fantastic.
we always want the story from Central Asia,
Yeah.
Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan is another one that we do have a lot of. I mean,
Thank
it's just a
you.
question of mining those essays and getting these kids to actually write it for a publication. But those essays are fantastic, we have some really good stuff and lots of alternative stories, so if you want that, we can talk about that later.
Thank you. That is what we want, actually.
There's also an kind of analytical framework issue, when we think about development in that context. So you're looking at the space which was actually highly industrialized and highly developed by all measures. So you're looking at a system which is literally in free fall, rather than developing from ground as you would
Yeah,
look at.
yeah.
So the methodological frameworks are completely from Africa, Asia,
Yeah.
and South America, which are completely different,
Yeah.
ball game. So way to think about development and how they articulate, how internally they will articulate that same story,
Mhm.
versus how we'll observe it, are again not intersecting. Very
Yeah.
well.
I agree. I think because my background is development studies. One of the things we struggle, I think, is to sort of figure out where the post-Soviet countries are located in that narrative, because it's very easy to kind of bring in India,
Yeah.
Southeast Asia, but actually Central Asia was always not in that narrative.
Yeah.
And
But Eastern Europe is
interesting.
a place where one can start to think about it and
yeah,
coming from.
but then they kind of put it
Yeah.
as an EU
Yeah.
studies sort of
Yeah,
framing,
but-
which
but
is problematic as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah. On the question of where the business sector lies, so maybe I gave a bit of a wrong impression. I myself have done a lot of interviews with the big mining companies in Europe. We very much look into what the business sector really, what they're interested in terms of the policy, public policy preferences, and also where they identify the points of conflict with government. And so I agree with you, the significance of looking into the business sector. I think what's kind of interesting, particularly in the case of Central Asia, is the dynamics between the foreign players. And we already have some initial data on this. So for example, to our surprise, Netherlands is the biggest FDI provider in Kazakhstan, which didn't make sense for quite a while for us. So at the beginning, I even thought this must be like, money laundering kind of investment, but apparently
Don't
it's
rule it
not.
out.
Yeah, apparently it's not. And so I think China is only placed fourth, which is surprising, because I think people have assumed that because of the intensive and the concentrated amount of investments that went through the BRI, that China would actually be the biggest player. So there's actually quite interesting data that we're looking into at the moment, trying to figure out and making sense before we go to the field. But I think a large part of that is, what kind of dynamics there is between the foreign and the domestic players. The other part is, of course, I think we do need to make a distinction between state capital and private capital, particularly in the mining industry. In the 90s and early 2000s, Chinese companies would be buying unprofitable mines in Africa, in Latin America. By no standard would any private company do that, because of the high levels of risk, fears of nationalization, all these many factors. And yet China, that was one of the biggest puzzles in the mining sort of sphere. Like, why are Chinese companies buying all these different mineral projects if they're not profitable? Because as we know, private investment is driven by shareholder value, and if the shareholders, want money in a particular time period, you won't be able to sustain such kinds of investment planning. And then, of course, now, 20 years after, we now know why the Chinese were doing that in the 90s and early 2000s. And so part of what we are trying to also do is to kind of make that distinction between the logic of private investment in the mining industry and the logic of state capital. That is not to say that there is no logic of private accumulation in state companies. I actually think the success of Chinese state companies is really based on the embrace of the private logic of capital accumulation. What, of course, they've done is to restructure the companies in a way where you could separate the day-to-day management of the company to make them profitable and the ownership. So who ultimately calls the shot on the big decisions, that remains in the hands of the state. And so I think that's an important kind of distinction in understanding the logic of private accumulation in strategic industries specifically, because of course they would allow, for example, in agriculture, that's more private sector driven. Technology sectors, high-tech sectors, they're much more technology intensive, capital intensive accumulation, more private sector than state logic. So I think that's also one of the things we've been trying to look into the project is
the private sector. This debate also has two technical aspects. One is that private sector needs an overall ecosystem of
yes,
variety of both financial and technical subcontracting. If it's not there, you can't just say we'll have a private sector.
yeah,
It's a huge thing, and that's consolidated within usually the national companies.
yeah.
So that
And of course
structural issues, yeah.
I think part, of course, of what we've been looking at is you cannot look at investment projects without looking at the financial mechanisms in which mining companies leverage investment, because these are projects that require at least 10 years of sustained investment. And so once you've done the investment, you cannot also pull out because the money is too big that you've invested. And so there's also really interesting research on how Chinese companies, for example, manage political and social conflicts in the mining sector. It's very different from the private companies because they have a much more long-term view in the mining industry compared to private sector. And so that also means they're more concessional with the demands of the local community. So that's also, there's some research that has been done on Africa looking at this. So we're hoping to kind of differentiate that type of, we hope to be able to do that kind of research looking into the different types of capital. Just on the final point on the specific question of are we looking at it from a sectoral point of view or the mining point of view? My preference, and I think my PhD student is online, so my preference is we actually kind of trace the mining, the critical minerals and how they move up in the specific sectors identified by the government. But that is premised on the assumption that that there are very clear links between the mining sector and the identified renewable energy projects. And I know for a fact that even in cases like Brazil, that's not very straightforward. So I think that's also the challenge. So we want to leave it open, but what we're sure is that the field sites are the 3 cities we identified because we know that that's where the most of the investments go. So what we're gonna try is to kind of start looking at, okay, where the investments are currently located, where are there, and how does that lay out with the general national development plans? And then hopefully we will be able to trace the sector. So that's part of the discussion we've been having in the project, because from the consuming countries, what is ideal is, of course, that you kind of map it out, and the industrial strategy plans in the mining countries and the consuming countries would kind of overlay, because the idea is the investment, the money, the policy actually sort of overlap. That's the ideal situation of sort of looking into the supply chain as a whole. But I think it will really depend on the country-specific cases. And so we probably would need to suspend a bit of the decision-making on the sector because of that. So I mean, if you have suggestions also, please let us know. We'd be very happy.
Sectors.
Yeah, wait, so you can have that discussion later. David has been waiting for a while. David, go ahead and unmute yourself then.
That was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much
Oh.
indeed. Enjoyed every moment of it. One element, if I may, there is this public-private sector link you've been talking about, the policy imperatives and so on. And I've noticed recently there's been a bit of a pullback against the use of electric vehicles in the UK, in Europe, in the USA. We've seen at the consumer level, the heads of Stellantis saying there's too much government interference. We should be letting the market decide what we get, not the public sector, not the government. We've had the head of Toyota saying much the same, and that electric vehicles will only be valid for about a third, if that, of world usage because of infrastructure and other problems. And again, saying let the market decide. So it seems in that area, and bear in mind we've had electric vehicles since the late 19th century. I think the world land speed record was held by a battery electric car in 1890 odd. We have a situation where the government is interfering in a market, distorting it, and I suspect, and you will know far better than I, that makes it more difficult to get private investment into some of these mining and other operations when the future consumption of the end product is uncertain because of government interference. What's your view on that?
Do we get?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
sure.
can answer.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so the EV car industry is complicated for two reasons, right? One is it's a very long supply chain, and then the other issue is, of course, it's now being driven mainly by two companies. So I think that unless you so there's two things, and then there's a third aspect, which is the extent to which the trajectory of EV usage will take place, basically EV expansion. I do know that in some countries that they don't want to rely on EV cars. So I think the EV car strategy is very much an energy transition strategy of Europe and US. And so I would agree with your assessment, David, that if we're entirely reliant on US and EU's market consumption of EV cars, then that entirely would be dependent on how these two markets behave, basically the consumption patterns here. Where I think I will diverge slightly from your point is that the critical mineral sector is going to be needed across different sectors. So, I mean, we always talk about the EV car, but actually wind turbines also, offshore and onshore wind turbines, solar panels. The issue with the scarcity of CRM is that all these three big renewable energy sectors require the same metals. They will be copper, they will be nickel, it would be permanent magnets from rare earth elements. So in fact, I think there's a whole debate at the moment whether the EV car industry will be taking the minerals, or is it going to be the wind power, or is it going to be the solar panels? And that's not an automatic sort of process, because the renewable energy projects need to be competitive enough. And then, of course, there's the hydrogen project. So I didn't talk about hydrogen here, but Japan, Korea are banking on hydrogen, not the EV car. They think that hydrogen is going to be the thing that will solve the carbon footprint. So that then has a different set of raw materials that you need in order to build. Of course, some of that. So, for example, I know that some of the fuel and the storage systems would be similar in some renewable energy projects and hydrogen. So there may be some overlaps there. But I do think if we're specifically just talking on EV car, you may be right in terms of that the CRM demand might decrease as a reflection of the changing behavior or of the consumer market. I think where there might be some divergence is, and this is the case for Latin America, one of the main drivers to expand the EV car industry is to decarbonize the public transport system. And so the assumption, or at least the hope of many governments, is that we would shift our public transport system. So not just, well, I mean, that's been happening now in Europe and the US, right? But in Latin America, for example, they're hoping that there would be some EV-based, electric vehicle-based public transport system. So part of the demand for EV cars would not just be coming from private owners, but also from the public transport system. And the hope is by doing that, you then sustain the demand for these critical minerals. I don't know to what extent that's good, because if you're demanding the same types of metals across 3-4 sectors, so then that fear that, you know, that we don't have enough critical minerals to sustain all the renewable energy projects might actually be a real policy problem. So there's a whole debate on that. You know, like if we're using the same metals across different sectors of renewable energy projects, and of course, you know, defense and military are also, they also need critical minerals. So there's also like all these overlaps. And so if that's the situation, I think there's enough demand for critical minerals. The question is, how does the market distribute the critical minerals? You know, which sectors get them? And then that is where your question around the public-private question will come in. I do think that the EV car is still as competitive, I think, in terms of projections. I know for a fact that the last 3-4 years, they've had sustained increase. There will be an effect though, you know, the investigation on subsidies on, you know, the BYD, basically the EU is trying to investigate BYD subsidies and whether that would merit a protectionist policy within the European Union. But I think they're doing that in the pretext of creating protection for the EV car industry here. I don't think it's because they want to shift away. And so that could be a matter of, you know, preference, right, between Volkswagen versus BYD and Tesla in Europe, as opposed to let's move away from the EV car sector as a renewable energy strategy.
Okay, there are some questions in chat, but most of them are comments, so I'll leave them for now.
Yeah, then no
Why?
question. What is this one?
I actually had one question of my own while we scroll through the 300 questions we have on chat.
Well, this all information will give it to you.
Please do.
You mentioned briefly that you were looking at Korea and Central Asia, and you said something about how their trade deals were unsuccessful. Did I get that wrong?
Yeah, no, yeah.
No, yeah?
Yeah, correct.
So which is, so that doesn't seem right to me. Because
Well, it
Korea,
was-
Central, sorry, go ahead.
No. So yes, so I got that information specifically from the former. So he was a former ambassador of Korea to Kazakhstan.
Okay.
So they were trying to establish trade deals. Specifically, I think they wanted to leverage specific Korean companies to move into
Yeah.
to finance this specific mining project. And that ultimately failed. And
So
that
it was,
fun.
maybe it was more specific to mining, because I mean, Korean companies, correct me if I'm wrong, are all over the place in Central Asia, and they have a very long relationship. And
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
they were more successful than many other countries in the past.
So more in the car industry or?
They've been building.
Well, good car, yeah.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah,
Uzbekistan,
I
but-
think
but
car,
They,
yeah.
they have, I mean, there are few sectors, agro, but hospitality is a very big one.
Yeah,
So you have Lotte, which.
Okay, so more consumer, yeah.
so there's, I mean, it's
Yeah.
there, and they.
So it's
they have-
specific to my, yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
I'm talking
yeah, maybe.
specific
No, I
to
was just
mining.
confused.
Actually,
Because I
there,
thought that-
there is both, thesis and papers by Nikolai Moroshkin,
Yeah,
group, so one of our former PhD students, so he actually looked specifically at, despite quite a heavy, economic presence of Korean and Japanese in Central Asia, how come they don't have the political clout?
Yeah,
And why EU and US have nearly no investment and yet have political clout, so, but there's a lot.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
So,
okay, yeah, but that was just something that kind of, anyway, so I'm going to pull back from a very good discussion on critical minerals from a scientific point of view almost, or market perspective, and ask you a more geopolitical question. some of the shifts and some of the trends that you're seeing, do you think this is a problem? I think you said it, but I'll ask you anyway. That this is a problem specifically created by EU and what you call the US-led global model. Because
And I'm going to show
in
you some
principle,
evidence.
in principle, the fact that if Korea and Japan want to look at hydrogen and somebody else wants to look at cobalt and somebody wants to look at lithium and so on, so it is, from my perspective, a good thing.
Yeah.
Right, because there is then more access and you worry less about you worry less about losing those resources because everybody is going to do that, right? And then there's a question of which country is better than the other and who has more clout and so on and so forth. So I guess my question is that with China's entry and a very different way of looking at this, and of course, there's a lot of bad clout and bad press that China gets, but we have Yingfeng who did a fantastic PhD on the BRI in Kazakhstan, and we have other students who've looked at it. Will that help in a shift, at least for developing economies, including India and other places, to look at this whole market and this whole public versus private in a slightly different way, which is what you're saying. So actually your mapping will be fantastic because they can actually look at that and then academics can work on that. So do you think that is where we're headed? Or we should be headed there rather than have to worry about how much lithium we need?
So I think the starting point is, of course, that we now recognize that, because economists love convergence theory, right? That we all converge to a particular model, or like we converge towards specific patterns. I do think that there are immutable differences in terms of the Chinese strategy, but generally also the Chinese governance model. And of course, what we know about China is that they do export some of the features of these models when they move abroad. So, and the earlier and the earlier we recognize this, the better we are able to understand, why China behaves differently compared to other countries. So I think part of that is recognizing that there's diversity in terms of the strategy. The other part is, of course, I do think that some of the elements of the Chinese strategy are coming from lessons from the failures and successes of the 20th century development strategies. The Chinese model of state enterprise, they did not get rid of state enterprises because they knew that it could do something, and that came from the socialist model of the USSR. But they also knew that it couldn't do everything, and that's how they adapted some of these reforms coming from Japan and Korea and even Taiwan, the developmental state features of strong public bureaucracy, the need to build institutions. And so the success of the state companies in China, especially during the high period when they were trying to go abroad, that's pretty much an outcome of these sort of steps and lessons around how to advance a more prominent role for the state, but also minding the fact that the market needs to play a role. Of course, that has changed within China as well, and that's a different debate. But for developing countries, I think the lessons were very clear. From the point of view of, for example, development strategy, that because a lot of developing countries were generally unhappy anyway with the Washington consensus, then they suddenly realized, well, actually, because China is in their face, suddenly, there's an alternative model. The question of how alternative models can be adapted, that's a different sort of debate. And, we could discuss that. But I think the consensus around relying on the private sector, I think that has been really broken from early 2000. The problem, of course, is that, and I do think this is the case for many developing countries. At some point, you do need to develop private sector capacity. So you cannot rely on the state, making important market decisions and making decisions all the time. And so part of the lesson we have from sort of development economics is USSR failed because it kept on refusing to recognize the market signals. And I think a lot of developing countries would be better off thinking about, what these market signals are and how you should respond. In the same way, of course, for example, if you do decide to build state enterprises, so my last big research is on reforming state enterprises. One of the big lessons there is that you do need a clear idea in terms of what you want to do with the state company. So the successes of state company is partly because they're able to function as a private company, but also still respond to the demands of society and the state. The situation for the, and I do understand, like in some places, it's very hard to build state companies. Like Philippines is a good example where we will not build a state company because we just don't have that tradition. And so then you need to rely on whatever instruments of development policy that you're accustomed to and tailor fit that policy that is so that you're able to achieve whatever public policy objective you want. I think there is empirical and comparative historical evidence that countries with strong manufacturing capacity, a record of public enterprise creation, they do tend to have a lot more ability to export diversification. They're able to adapt, because the state is more agile and they have more capacity to maneuver. So that I think is true for some countries, particularly, so my experience is in Latin America, and you do have successful state companies there, in a region that has implemented wide-ranging market reforms across sector. So I think the lesson there is, it's not that, we need to decide the public and the private immediately, but I think there has to be a recognition of the successes of certain models and, of course, adapting that to what is useful. If you're very successful in leveraging foreign investment, I don't see any reason why you should give that away, right? So I think part of it is knowing what you're good at and then developing that further. And then, of course, making sure that the other reforms follow so that you have a much more coherent approach to economic development dilemmas. Question. Thank you.
I wanted to show you that this is, we've been discussing this since, this is the formal
2009.
agreement. We were discussing few years before that, by the time it came to that. So it's your target company.
Thank you. Please send it to us.
I'll show you more of it later.
Thank
Okay,
you.
any other thoughts, comments before we let Jojo relax and have lunch maybe? Any burning question? Okay, nobody's saying anything, so I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you. Thank you so much for the talk and for the discussion, and thank you everybody for coming. And like I said, 23rd of March, please put it in your diaries, Jesus College, starting at 7 o'clock. There'll be circulation, dance, music, Ainsley will be performing, hopefully. And so on and so forth. Thank you, Chokan. I see some familiar names, and I see Pavel as well, but I will share with you some of the essays we've had.
Thank you so much. That would be
We're
fantastic.
still in touch with most of these people. We'll be happy to give away their copyright. Thank you, everybody. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
We actually have a scholar from Korea next week, so it's you. She's giving a talk about tea, but anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew. All right, Zoom saying bye to you all. See you next week.